Hi, folks. Welcome to another episode of Film Study. This is Ken McCusick. We're here with a Film Study short today with an old friend of the show, Eric Eager. Used to be a PFF. He now works for Sumer Sports in a role I'm going to let him tell you about because it sounds incredibly interesting. Eric, how are you doing?
And it has been a long time. Thank you for having me on. Sumer has been a lot of fun. We're trying to build tools for optimization for rosters in both the team side as well as the fantasy and gaming side. It's been a lot of fun. I've gotten to work with some incredibly talented people. I know you've had like Tay Seth on the
Sure.
show before, and he's one of our data scientists, incredibly talented and fun to work with. And so, it's been a joy. And honestly, it's been a lot of fun just to kind of explore different notions of team building and try to codify them in a way that is robust.
So, Eric, PhD in applied math, correct?
That's right.
And very much responsible for building PFF's intern program and hiring some absolute studs over there. Arjun Menon is another guy who comes to mind. I have that name correct, don't I?
Yeah, Arjun, Tay Seth, both of them were from the University of Michigan. Arjun got an internship this summer with the Jets. Did really well there. Zach Drapkin, who formerly of the Wharton School, is currently a full-time guy with the Eagles. And then Haley English, she's working with the Detroit Lions as an intern right now. And then Judah Fortgang, who is a very accomplished sports bettor now, works for a company called SIG and is setting markets there. So I've been incredibly blessed to be able to help people who only needed a chance in the industry and to show us what they could do. And they blessed me back with a fantastic work, and it's been great.
Well, I can say from the ones I've met of that fantastic selection of talent too, which is no small feat when you're going looking for interns. So great job, Eric. Let's talk a little bit. And I wanted to go back to something I saw that was just piqued my interest, and a lot of your stuff it has kind of an edge to it. I'm sure you're kind of going for this, but it was talking about the Cardinals potentially drafting 2 quarterbacks in the first round in the coming draft, where they may have as many as 3 first-round picks.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, this goes back, and you and I have a long history of like watching football and understanding the league, and like I go back to like 1989, right, where Dallas, and we might see this in New England, for example. Tom Landry, one of the best coaches in the history of the NFL. Jerry Jones buys the franchise. Let's Landry go after a 3-13 season in 1988. That roster really has like no talent other than Herschel Walker and, if you squinted, Michael Irvin, Nate Newton, all those guys who ended up being good, but weren't good at the time. Much like this, the Cardinals, for example, and some other teams, we're starting over, and it's incredibly hard to start over in the NFL because, as the Bears have shown, you can get a ton of draft picks, but it's because a lot of these premium positions and things like that, they take forever to materialize. You have all these draft picks, but they don't always turn out to be what you expect when you need them to. And places like tackle, even edge is a position where I think that there's a bigger learning curve than a lot of people will want to admit, even though the position is efficient from an evaluation standpoint. The Cowboys back in 1989 took Troy Aikman with the first pick. But then a couple months later took Steve Walsh, who had played at Miami for Jimmy Johnson. They took him with the pick with the first round pick in the supplemental draft. They were 1-15 in 1989. So that pick ended up being the first overall pick in the 1990 draft. And so they had, Aikman and Walsh. And I think in hindsight, it's clear who was better. But at the time, it wasn't necessarily clear who was better. First, draft picks back then didn't play early on, right? Guys like Brett Favre sat for a year for the Falcons. It was really an anomaly when Rick Meyer, Andrew Bledsoe both played a lot in their first years, being the first and second pick in 1993. So those high draft picks also cost a lot of money because we didn't have the rookie wage scale back then. So there were all these competing factors. And so Dallas goes ahead and they trade Herschel Walker. They get a ton of picks. And they get Emmitt Smith, they get Darren Smith, they get Darren Woodson, I'm sorry. And they get all these players and they kind of spread it out. They end up winning Super Bowls in 92, 93, 95. And I still think that one of the biggest things that they did that was actually very sharp was They had Steve Walsh. They played him. He showed enough in 5 starts in 1989. He got their only win. That when the Saints were dealing with a holdout to Bobby Hebert, their long-standing franchise quarterback, they were able to get a first and a third one year and a second the following year for Steve Walsh as a backup. And to me, we look around the league, right? Aaron Rodgers tears his Achilles. The Jets are kind of stuck with Zach Wilson. You look at places like Denver where you're not quite sure what you're able to do with Russell Wilson, so on and so forth. And you also look at the first picks and, even going back, like in 2021, Trevor Lawrence played all the games, but Justin Fields didn't play all the games. He was hurt some. Zach Wilson was hurt some. Mac Jones played all the games. Last year, he didn't. This year, you've had injuries, of course, to, Bryce Young's missed a game. Anthony Richardson is going to miss multiple games. When you have a situation like that where you're rebuilding and you're building up a young quarterback, the best hedge is when that guy gets hurt, because it is a when, to have a young quarterback that you can showcase for the rest of the league and spread out your talent across multiple years of drafting. And so, the Cardinals are very.
Let me unpack just a second here on this, because I really want to ask a question here. Is the Walsh pick ended up being the first overall, so that has tremendous value. And whether or not you believe in all the peaking that exists in JJ, there's still peaking in all systems towards that number 1 pick being of a lot more value. Would it really be fair to say that the Cowboys realized all the value, even getting a 1, a 2, and a 3 in exchange for that? I don't know what the Saints gave up in terms of their position in the first round, which is going to be the most important thing. But I mean, it's a good example of rolling value and a good example of resetting their draft. Is it really a good example of retaining most of that value?
Well, I think if you account for the likelihood that Walsh could have been their franchise quarterback, I think you do. So, okay, the first of all, and I actually have to look at the Saints in 1990 were 8-8. They made the playoffs. Actually, it's funny because in 1990 they made the playoffs because Troy Aikman got injured and Steve Walsh wasn't there to back him up. And the Cowboys lost their last 2 games and the Saints won a game with Steve Walsh. And so they got in the playoffs, but they were picking kind of in the middle of the draft. And to your point, like depending upon which draft curve you use, that first pick is worth more. It can be worth more than the 16th pick. And or at the time, it might have been 14 or 15 because there are only 28 teams. And then the second and a third. But you also have that nugget of probability that Steve Walsh could have been something for the Cowboys. And by 1990, you allowed yourself the opportunity to think about Troy Aikman with a clear mind. And I think that is actually the biggest part of it, which is, if you are pot committed to Zach Wilson, if you're pot committed to Justin Fields, so on and so forth, you're not allowed to really evaluate him with the clear mind that you would be if you had an actual second option. And so it's a good question. I have to go back and look. I do think, though, that given that nugget of likelihood that Walsh could have been a real quarterback, and you were allowed to evaluate Troy Aikman, who ended up being Super Bowl MVP and win 3 rings, you were allowed to evaluate him with the open mind that comes with having a legitimate second option. I think it ended up being worth it. Especially if you go into the year when you take Walsh in June of 1989, you don't know that ends up being the first pick until you lose all your games.
Well, that's a legitimate point. I give you one more that's on the side of you want to draft the guy and then trade him. Is that the first overall pick, if the Cowboys had him when the pick came around, is not worth as much in that era of highly peaked rookie salaries. Now, it got worse in the Jamarcus Russell era, where people would rather not have the pick at all. But it was still pretty bad in the early 90s.
Well, and to your point, the first overall pick isn't worth as much. In a traditional sense, if you have the first overall pick and you have a quarterback, it's not worth as much, other than if you were to leverage it in a trade, which we know Jimmy Johnson traded more than any other franchise combined during that time. So he probably would have ransomed that pick. But in the truest sense, like that number 1 pick isn't worth as much to a team that has a quarterback, because that's really where, when you look at the spikiness, like Myles Garrett's a fantastic player, but he's never going to accumulate as much value as a quarterback is going to. And so, again, this is one of those where you're sort of able to spread it out a little bit and realize that a little bit later. And that's when I think about the Cardinals. I think about, look, the Cardinals are multiple premium position players away from being good. And much like the Bears, when they were in a position with the number one pick earlier this offseason, it's really difficult to build just through the draft. And it's almost impossible because the Bears had all this cap space, which might not be the actual thing for the Cardinals because of all the money in Murray's contract, but it is impossible to build through free agency. Like you cannot access tried and true talent at left tackle, wide receiver, cornerback. Edge defender actually is somewhat like where you can get lower to your guys. And especially like, I know you cover the Ravens, like you can get some decent players there, but if you are truly rebuilding from scratch, it is actually pretty hard to do so without trading for a premium position player who is a veteran already, like DJ Moore, or who I wanted the Bears to trade for was Brian Burns, the defensive end from the Panthers. I thought that because when you have money to spend, you're going to go out and do what the Bears did, which is spend money on linebackers and spend money on guards. And that you're just not getting good return there. But at the same time, if you're going to draft tackles and draft wide receivers and draft corners, those players are also going to take longer to mature. And you just never know because of the hit rates, whether they will. And so I think taking a quarterback and kind of using that asset, letting it mature over a year or two, and then trading that asset, trading the player for possibly premium position players or something like that, to me is a better way of going about team building when you're starting from scratch.
Okay, so I think this is a great point, and the Ravens fans certainly understand the notion of a heaped draft like they had in 2018. They got a ton of talent in one draft, and it all came due at the same time. The Ravens actually were very sharp about unwinding that draft with a trade of Hayden Hurst and a trade of Orlando Brown. There's another one in there too, trade of Kenny Young, to get Marcus Peters. So they did some good unwinding of that draft as they went along the line. They still managed to lose Zach Sealer, who ended up being a hell of a player. I guess what I want to ask you is, how did you differentiate between the having Tom Brady and drafting like a Jimmy Garoppolo with a second round pick as a way to farm for additional quarterback tradable value when you have no intention of ever letting your franchise quarterback go? Matt Castle made the same.
Yeah, that's a good point. I have one of my friends who works in the league. When we talk about Jalen Hurts, I talk about Jalen. So Jalen Hurts is the good example, right? Because Jalen Hurts is taken in the second round. In theory, you have an established quarterback, but you're not 100% on him, clearly. And when we were talking about Jalen Hurts, I'm like, oh, that was a great draft pick. And he goes, well, in hindsight, though, wouldn't you rather have just taken, like, how valuable is that player? And I think Mike Sando did this analysis. When you look at like the 5th-year option hit rates after about pick 20, there's almost maybe more value to take Hurts in that back half of the first round than it is to take him in the second round, because that 5th-year option on that player just gives you that ability. And I think the 5th-year option is a little bit overrated for the guy that you want to be the starter, but I think it's actually fine. I think it's actually properly rated for the player that you're going to try to use as an asset, like a Jordan Love, like a Jalen Hurts, because you ultimately the clock doesn't tick. I always look back at like the Aaron.
With the busy fall season already in swing, you might be looking for wholesome, convenient meals for jam-packed days. Factor, America's #1 ready-to-eat meal kit, can help you fuel up for breakfast, lunch, and dinner with chef-prepared, dietitian-approved, ready-to-eat meals delivered straight to your door. You'll save time, eat well, and stay on track with your healthy lifestyle. Guys, I've shared moving. I was using this for all my meals. Now I'm working from home. Guess what? Microwaves in the other room. I'm using this for all my meals. Factor is how I get through my lunch day every day. But they've got breakfast, lunch, and dinner. I haven't tried the breakfast ones yet, but why not? I think I might add that to my next order. But I love them for lunch. Plus, they've got new autumn fall flavors out right now for limited time, featuring seasonal veggies like cranberry, pecan chicken, and apple Dijon pork chops. And again, just like everything else, they're ready in just 2 minutes. They'll satisfy your fall cravings during this busy season without the hassle. So go ahead and level up with Gourmet Plus options as well, prepared to perfection by chefs and ready to eat in record time. Treat yourself to upscale meals with premium ingredients like broccoli, leeks, truffle butter, and asparagus. Head to factormeals.com/ravens50 and use the code ravens50 to get 50% off. That's code ravens50 at factormeals.com/ravens50 to get 50% off your Factor meal today.
Rodgers thing, and a lot of Packers fans really want to compare Aaron Rodgers to Jordan Love because, the obvious taking 3 years to sit on the bench. But when Aaron Rodgers signed his initial contract, it was a 5-year, $7 million deal where the 5th year was not an option for the player or the team. And so, and it wasn't expensive. Like nowadays, first round picks options are not cheap anymore. And especially if the guy plays at all, and has some success, it's not expensive. And so with Rodgers, they had really 2 years of cheap control. So if he blew up in year 4 when he first started, and this is what happened, you can give him a modest middle-class quarterback contract. And now you have the league is your oyster, right? Because that's really, if you can get a quarterback who's good on a modest deal, you have the league, you're holding good cards. In the case of Love, it was sort of like, it was kind of this in-between deal that kind of still puts them in limbo. And if he blows up this year, you're giving him the real quarterback contract, the Daniel Jones deal that no one wants to give out anymore. Mm-hmm. And if he struggles, you've wasted essentially that year on something you didn't, you found out things, of course, but you're wasting a year of not drafting another guy or something like that. And so it is really this weird situation where I do think for the purposes of the Cardinals, for example, if you were to go, let's say they luck out and they get the first and second pick. I think CJ Stroud is actually too good to be bad enough to get them the second pick. But let's assume you have a pick that other people covet and you're at 1-2. You take Caleb Williams at 1, you trade the second pick for maybe the 10th pick. You get a first round pick in the following year. You take a tackle, wide receiver, corner, edge, some position there. And then Kyler Murray nets you the 25th pick and some other stuff, including money from the Murray contract coming back to you. I think that 25th pick with the 5th-year option, with the youth, with the scarcity at the position that we've all seen this year, I think that if that player is a quarterback, he, A, in all likelihood is going to play. And he's going to show some team some potential. And B, he's a hedge against the first overall pick not working out, which we know it has a real possibility of happening.
Okay, but a lot of the strategy really depends on your first overall pick not being an Iron Man who kind of never leaves the field, because otherwise you degrade the value in a certain sense of your 25th overall pick, because the rest of the league sees that he has no value to you, and they also are hesitant to pull the trigger on a trade for a guy that they haven't had showcased to them.
Yes, but we agreed. I also think that there's a part of, in a 17-game schedule, there's value in being able to not Andrew Luck the guy, right? Where Andrew Luck played a bunch of games where he shouldn't have played. And obviously his career came short. Like Lamar Jackson, of course, has had his bouts with injury where there's some games where you're wondering, should he play, should he not? I think having that option also allows you to make sure that your quarterback is evaluated when he's healthy and not necessarily having to run him out there and do it. Like I remember, it gives you some optionality there, but then you're right. It does hinge on the fact that quarterback might not play a ton. I'll say though, if that quarterback plays every game at a level where you have no doubts about, you have no impetus to play the other guy, then you've won, right? And so that, if you draft a quarterback at first overall and he turns out to be Trevor Lawrence, then every other one of your draft picks is a rounding error to your process, right? And true. We know there are obvious, there are obvious caveats to that, of course. But so in that case, yes, it is kind of a wasted asset. But in the case that the guy plays as the first overall pick to that degree, it's not going to matter as much to your cause.
Okay, so hopefully you make the right choice on which guy you trade. How do you relativize the value then of what I would call the Belichick method, which I believe was usually to use a second round pick, and he had a long sequence of resetting his second round picks year after year, so that he had 2 every year, but he usually trade one and get a second and something else. How do you relativize those two things in a world where Brady probably is going to miss some games too, and you get Matt Castle on the field a little bit, you get Jimmy Garoppolo on the field a little bit?
Yeah, it's a good question because the Garoppolo was, I think, the one exception where they used a second on him. Ryan Mallett, I think, was a third that they got a seventh back from Houston because he had never ended up playing. Kevin O'Connell was, I believe, a third-round pick. Now the head coach of the Vikings, Kevin O'Connell, never really worked out. I'm trying to remember, but I think that there is enough of a drop-off from pick 25 to pick 45 or pick 62 to where that first-round label is actually going to like appeal to the teams. I do think that there is a difference between how the league would view a Jordan Love versus how they would view a Kyle Trask or a Kellen Mond or somebody like that. I do think the drop-off is stark. But, yeah, it is a good question. I think Belichick was, doing a good job of hedging his bets, and he did get a second back for Garoppolo for very little play. He had 2 starts for the Patriots that entire time. I think if you're not going to do the first round thing, and most teams don't have the luxury. I'm talking specifically about the Cardinals, who are going to have 3 first rounders in all likelihood, unless they keep Kyler Murray. I do think if you have fewer than, like, if you only had 2 first rounders, let's say, I think that this is less appealing for sure. I think in the case that you have 3, it really does make sense because the hit rate. So the bottom half of the first round, if you look at like the history of it, is generally speaking kind of a loser's range, and good on the Ravens for having done a better job than most. But like that bottom half of the first round is like the best players at non-premium positions, which are bad gambles, the safeties, linebackers,
center,
guards, centers, tight ends, or they're like the Chiefs with Felix Anazuke-Uzama. They're like the 5th edge player, right? And like, you're not getting, even though you're getting a premium position player, you're not getting an elite player there. And so like that bottom half of the first round, it's like, okay, if I'm going to do that, where I'm going to take a guy I'm going to take guys with limited upside from a value perspective, or I'm going to take guys with limited upside from is he a good player perspective? I'm going to take the guy with the limited upside from is he a good player perspective, but a tremendous value from if he actually does hit, he's going to be worth $50 million. Per year. And so that's kind of where I see it. I think in the case that you have 2 1s, it becomes less appealing to me to take that second quarterback for sure.
Let me ask the other thing that would come naturally to the thing. If you're worried about a stacked draft and you're worried about having talent stacked, it's all going to come due at the same time. So you have a lot of bonds coming due in the same year, effectively, that you're going to have to pay off this principal at the same time. But wouldn't you be better off just trading the draft pick itself to reset and get value from it? And how does it compare? Are you really having to fall back on the notion that the Cardinals have to get the quarterback right, and so they can't miss on one of 2 guys is so critical to the strategy?
Yeah, I think that the issue though is that we haven't seen teams have the appetite for that final quarterback of late. Like if you watch the sport, if you watch the lines, for example, if you watch the sports betting lines for the draft, if you bet under the number of quarterbacks in the first round every single year, you're going to win all the years except for, I think 2020, you actually pushed that number because it was 4. Every single year, even the Lamar Jackson year, the betting markets were 5.5 quarterbacks. Like they were thinking that there was a chance that Mason Rudolph would make it into the first round. Lamar's betting number was 16.5 that year. That was his over-under for pick position. And obviously we saw the Saints move up to 16, and like you could tell that I was betting on this draft. The Saints move up to 16 for Marcus Davenport, and we all thought that was Lamar. And Lamar falls all the way to 32. The league is kind of, I don't know if wising up is maybe the right word, in a sense of that pick has almost always been, other than Bridgewater and other than Lamar, a very bad quarterback. But the way that you win is you zig when other people are zagging. Like I actually do not believe that those teams covet the Will Levises, the Malik Willises, right? Every quarterback that would have been a candidate there has been undervalued in the marketplace right now. So if you wanted to trade that pick, I don't think you get the quarterback price for it.
Okay. So that's possible. And that's what you'd have to look at is year after year. What are you getting for pick 31, 32? The Eagles made it be known that 32 was available. They didn't really get a big premium from the Ravens the year that they drafted for. It's 2 2s. That was all they ended up getting.
Yeah, there was a trade up that was, well, and the Ravens traded back when they took Hurst and then up when they took Lamar. So that was a positive if you look at those 2 picks in the aggregate. But they really didn't get taken for the 32nd pick the way that some do. You know, for example, when, New England moved back and the Chargers took Kenneth Murray, that was a much bigger surplus for New England than was the move up for. And we know that. I mean, Eric DeCosta is a good GM and they have a very sharp analytics staff. Like they're never, even if they trade up, it's almost never going to be at that big of a discount. And in fact, if you account for, and this is where, this is another interesting topic that I'm going to write about, but like if you account for the fact that when a good team trades up, it's generally speaking more successful than when a bad team does. There is, like, when you look at the draft curves, there's sampling bias in the fact that, like, when Thomas Dimitrov, my boss, moves up and gets Julio Jones, like the 6th pick is actually going to be more valuable to a team like the Falcons than a team like the Browns, because the Browns are at that 6th spot for a reason. The Falcons are a better team. And so there is some like levels to, like, I trust the public models, but I think that they're a little bit biased towards bad teams picking high and hence the top picks not being worth as much. And good teams picking low, and those picks actually being worth less than what they should be worth.
That's great. But so that's a reheaping argument. You're saying that the heaping on some of the public models is not enough. I have another that I'd like to ask you for, and then I'll let you go here in just a second. The replacement level in a lot of the flatter models does not seem to properly be reflected. Like a subtraction of an arithmetic subtraction of the replacement level might really be appropriate, because at the end of the draft, you certainly have a lot of guys who might produce 2 AV career, and I still want the better metric than AV to judge these players. But if you start with AV, I mean, AV of 2 is nothing. It's you pick that up by playing special teams for a few years.
Yeah, exactly. And there are some models, like if you look at the way that the Vikings act with Kwesi Adolfo-Mensah, or the Browns where he came from with Andrew Berry, even the Ravens, like they treat picks after pick 5 as like those picks have 0 surplus value or worse. And I think that part of that is because of how the modern analytics account for replacement players, to your point. Like if you give up 3 picks for 1 pick, it's not that simple, right? Because you have to, if you take on those 3 players, then you have to give up roster spots. If you vacate those 2 picks, you have to supplement them back. And generally speaking, it depends. Again, I think that there are heterogeneities across team types that make some of those decisions less simple than the public models will make them out to be.
All right. Eric, always a pleasure to talk football with you. Very interesting thought experiment you're going through with the Arizona Cardinals here. Your writing I find very fun. Tell people where they can find it online.
Yeah, sumersports.com. We just debuted a bunch of our new metrics. I think we have some cool offensive line stuff with offensive line combinations. We have stats pages, we have simulations and everything. And I write a Friday column called My Friday Thoughts, which comes out every Friday morning, where I look at one thing I'm buying, one thing I'm selling, one thing I'm monitoring in the league. And I try to make it off the beaten path a little bit so that really smart people like you can find it interesting. And it's different than everybody else, that everybody else is trying to do, right? Like everybody loves football. And so I think, we're all looking for people that think a little bit differently, I think, in this space, because, it's an efficient market. So, I'm just trying to think about the league a little bit different than everybody else. I
probably look forward to conversations with you as much as with anybody else I talk football with, Eric, because it's always something a little different. And that's what's really cool about it. Other folks out there, if you'd like to be on a Film Study short, hit me up. DMs are always open on Twitter. I'll get back to you very quickly. Eric, thanks again for joining me and taking the time out of your busy day.
Ken, it's been a pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
And we'll talk to you next time on Film Study.